word. And all right, so we're gonna continue on in our study of Job, and we're going to finish up what Job, we really had just started. Chapters 16, 17, 19, and 21 are Job's answers to Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And so we kind of, in round two, split it up and talked first about what the three friends said, because there begins to be a lot of repetitive thought and a lot of repetitive conversation. We talked about that, how we all know what it feels like to be in conversation after conversation, and we begin to repeat ourselves. And the language became more harsh among the friends, that we begin to see more harsh conversation with these friends, and how they begin to be, because they can't logically figure this out, and there tends to be no reason for all of this, they begin to, their accusations become stronger, and poor Job is just kind of swallowed up in the intensity of the conversation. So we talked last week about chapter 16. We began the conversation of 17. We looked at these texts. Is everybody seeing my slides? Tina, can you give me a thumbs up? You can see them? Okay. All right. Just wanted to make sure, especially since we're recording. Okay. So we looked at this last week. We talked about how Job this is still in his response to Eliphaz, the elder of probably of the three friends, and how he really just says, okay, let me just step back here. I don't know. We've talked about how, when we look at the text of Job, we tend to want to say, okay, well, there were these three rounds of conversation. This friend spoke, then Job spoke, then this friend spoke, then Job spoke. And I'm not sure at all that that's true. We don't know how long Job was afflicted. We don't know how long Job went without understanding what was happening to him. We don't know if over the course of several weeks or even several months or even several years, Job had these continuous conversations with his friends. They could come up with nothing better than really in the end saying, if you'll turn back to God, that surely this has something to do with your life, that if you'll turn back to God, your hope can be restored in the earth. And so Job will talk about those things in these texts that we talk about tonight. And so he basically says, let me just wander through my thoughts here. He says, I am dying. This text we read last week, so I'm not going to reread it, and it's at the end of last week's lesson, but he says, I am dying, and that all of us are going to die, that our journeys all lead us to the grave. And he does say that his spirit is broken off. He's ready for the grave. The grave is ready for him. He talks about that here. And he says, I'm a matter of conversation and contempt. I'm mocked at. I'm laughed at. You speculate against me. You accuse me of things. I'm seen as a bad man. You've even talked about me behind my back. And so he warns them that everybody finally will face death, and that upon death, all will be judged. And it is interesting the things that Job does seem to understand about God. We often think, if Job did live in the days of Abraham, which I believe he did, and certainly in the patriarchal days, well before the law certainly was given. And if that is the case, there are things that through Job we understand they did understand, that God had not left men with no hope, that God had not left men to not understand. Remember, they understand Adam and Eve's relationship with God, that perfect relationship that God created man to be in with him, that's God's desire. It always has been, it always will be. And that God has allowed men, even from that point on, to know that his desire is to continue in that covenant relationship with them. And Job warns them that, they need to be careful, because it will affect their family, that the hypocrisy from which they come, this direction they come from to Job, will also will affect their own families. And he says, I'll tell you really, he says, I'll tell you how upright and righteous men, you come and claim that you're upright and righteous and that you have come to comfort me. But if you were, how upright and righteous men really would deal with someone like me in my affliction is that they would be amazed, that they would be astonished to find a good man in such an afflicted state, and that they would wonder at the mystery of God in a situation such as this. And of course, that is what happens to us, that we have been given more revelation probably, but really, this is true even in our day and age today, that what we ought to do with injustices on earth, to both the good and the innocent, injustices that happen with children, is that it ought to make us wonder about the mystery of God. We know that God is righteous and just, and we know that he is holy and completely perfect in his judgment and in his management of earth and God. But it must astonish us that his will at times is for those of us on earth to suffer. And I do think that that is true. And Job says what a righteous person would do with somebody like me is they would say, what a remarkable sufferer and saint this sufferer is. They would be astonished that righteous men would have been removed, and they would have been that they would have been moved, and that they would have been motivated to do better and to do more good. And that's what Joy and I were talking about before the class started, that we should be motivated when we think about afflictions that God gives, that it makes us more vigorous in our efforts to help with injustices, to be more compassionate, to understand that bad things do happen to good people, and that people find themselves in situations that we might be able to serve when we observe afflictions, that it makes us more lively in duty and more warm and affectionate and compassionate and more resolute and determined and undaunted to battle Satan, to be warriors in this campaign. Matthew Henry, I quoted this last week, says, the blustering wind makes the traveler gather his cloak the closer about him and gird it the faster. Those that are truly wise and good are continually growing wiser and better. Proficiency in religion is a good sign of sincerity in it. That if we are truly sincere in our religious efforts, that they would have had the exact opposite response, that they had become hypocrites in the way that they had dealt with Job, their friend, who they came to be compassionate to. So Job's friend had pretended to comfort him, talking about the hopes of his return of prosperity on earth. And so Job says here, please come back again, all of you. He says, come back and listen to me, what I'm going to say. My days are past, my purposes are broken off, even the thoughts of my heart, they change the night into day. The light is near, they say, in the face of darkness. If I wait for the grave as my house, if I make my bed in the darkness, if I say to corruption, you are my father, and to the worm, you are my mother and my sister, where then is my hope? As for my hope, who can see it? Will they go down to the gates of Sheol? Shall they have rest together in the dust? So he says that they have not been much help, that they have left him actually without hope, that if we hope in the earth, that is not where the hope can come from for a man who is afflicted. He says, look at all my measures, all my reasoning, everything is gone. I'm full of confusion about this, he says. The things in the earth that are happening have no reason. There's no logic. The things of my past gave me purpose, but that's all been broken off. At this point, his children are gone. His household is gone. His purpose of work in the daytime is gone. His livestock is gone. His livelihood is gone. His job and what he had, his wife is estranged in the sense of her thinking. The thoughts and the plans that he had in the past are no longer possible. And so he says it's all gone. In fact, there's no rest. The night is like day, and the ease of the night is no longer restful for me. I don't have any rest. There's affliction and trials that dominate both the day and the night. So all expectations of the world and life really have gone. And the grave is an easy bed if you're in that. That's where the hope lies, he says. They have told him to hope in the world, to just turn back to God, and all of this will be restored, that everything will be restored. And he says, no, I hope in the grave where God can be found. You know, these are true words for all of us. Earth does not give a final hope. Everything is shallow outside of our eternal rest. You know, when you're young, you hope in education, you hope in beauty, you hope in prosperity. If you're just in the world, those are the things that you hope for. Those are the things that you long for. They're the things that you find purpose in. Of course, young Christians surely can overcome that. But as you get older, you should see the lack of hope in those things, because you'll have losses and you'll have disappointments, and you'll find yourself in situations that you did not expect yourself to be in, circumstances that you haven't expected yourself to be in. Your life doesn't line up the way that at 18 you've put it on graph paper to be. I don't know. Does anybody use graph paper anymore? Or you've plotted out your life to be. And life itself, Job says, ought to have taught us that good people find themselves in all kinds of situations in life, that the grave is the hope, that is where hope is found, that earth does not give a final hope. And our hopes in life fall deeply into the grave with our bodies, and they all return to dust. And he says, but I'm not hopeless, because I don't hope in the earth. It's that simple. And it's a great lesson for us. It is the only way to deal with afflictions and losses and disappointments and circumstances that overcome our lives. It is the only way. There is no one who gets to the end of their life and says, I've had no disappointments and everything has worked out just the way I lined it up, and I was going to marry at this time, and I was going to do this at this time, and I was going to have no losses, and I was going to have no disappointments, and everybody in my life was going to act exactly like I thought they were going to and supposed to, and I've never been sick, and I've never been ill, and I've never had any pain, and I've never had any setbacks. I mean, that is ridiculous. We're not promised wealth and health and comfort and stuff in this life, and therefore let us not hope in it. Now, what I will say to Christians is that most of us find ourselves well favored with the blessings of life. Most of us in America, anyway, find ourselves to be well taken care of. We don't wake up wondering where we're going to get food. We don't. We're not searching for shelter at night. And so I will say that is something that we must be very, very aware of and never take for granted, and be very grateful for. Travel somewhere where you can see populations of people, large populations of people that don't have those types of blessings. And we will be more reminded that peace can never be found on the earth. Peace comes from within. Peace comes from God, and perfect peace will be found in the grave. And I long for it. In fact, there are days now with some of the losses that we've had and some of the things that have happened, you can even find yourself longing for that rest and longing for that time when God will sort everything out for you. That injustices will be dealt with, and that things that are said about ourselves or about those that we love will be dealt with. And those are things that we long for. And that's where Job was. these men were not going to solve his problems for him. Hope was not going to be found in the earth. And even if everything was restored, can you imagine? He's lost all of his children. It's never going to be justified in the earth. And what, I don't know what these men thought they were promising to Job. It is an interesting thing. And Job answered. This is now we've moved on to the text of Job after Bildad has spoken. Bildad's talked a lot about experiences, things that we all know based off of things that we see in life. Of course, he's got it wrong. None of these men understood the conversation that had happened in the heavens. None of these men understood the afflictions that God would not spare Job from. None of them understood that. It is interesting. We'll talk about this a little bit later on, but we surely see Christ in Job. I think about the fact that James, the author James in the New Testament, is the one who mentions Job. And James, I believe, is Jesus's physical brother, who was not a believer in Jesus until Jesus died. But I often wonder about the conversations in that little home in Nazareth, around the dinner table, and just as they're, they all knew Job well. These people knew Job well, who knew Christ and knew Jesus. And I wonder what Jesus must have been encouraged by when he thought of Job and how Job was afflicted and was able to overcome so well. Then Job answered in chapter 19, as he's answering Bildad, and said, "How long will you torment my soul and break me into pieces with your words? These 10 times you have approached me. You are not ashamed that you have wronged me. And if indeed I have erred, my error remains with me. If indeed you exalt yourselves against me and plead my disgrace against me, know then that God has wronged me and has surrounded me with his net. If I cry out concerning wrong, I am not heard. If I cry aloud, there is no justice." So he expresses his sentiments. And like I said, we surely see the afflicted Christ. Matthew Henry just talks about how Job's friends blamed him as a wicked man because he was so afflicted. And here he describes their unkindness, showing that they had condemned what was capable of excuse, that there was an excuse for all this. There was a reason for all this, and yet they blamed him. Harsh language from friends greatly adds to the weight of afflictions. Yet it is best not to lay it on the heart, lest we harbor resentment. Rather, let us look to him, Jesus, who endured the contradiction of sinners against himself and was treated with far more cruelty than Job was, or as we can be. Job said, "You torment my soul, and your words are even harder on me than my pain to my bones and my flesh." They broke him into pieces with his words. They gave him credit for bad character. They took away his good name. They laid untrue charges upon him. He says 10 times, I think this is a figurative language. I think this is like us. We say this often. We'll say, I bet she said it 100 times. I bet you told me that 100 times. And we say that all the time. And I think that is what this is talking about. 10 times would have been a full number or too much to compare. And he says over and over and over, you have been unkind. You have said untrue things. You've told irreversible lies about me. And they are not ashamed, he says. He says, it doesn't even bother you. You should be. He says, you should be embarrassed and ashamed of the words that you've said, but you're not. He says, this is not the way the upright and the righteous, as you claim to be, deal with people who are in affliction. And he says, I tell you that you speak unkindly. I'll tell you, we have to think about our words it is so easy for us to set judgment and for us to accuse someone of not dealing with affliction well, not understanding and saying things that we shouldn't about others. And if we promote conversation that has negative inclinations concerning others, whether we're right or whether we're wrong, we ought to be ashamed of ourselves. And that's what Job is saying here. There's no excuse before God for such. And we have to think about how we practice patience with others. Patience is not a virtue that I was naturally given, and it's something that I have to work on. I think it does get easier as you get older. I tend to move quickly. I tend to think and do quickly. and not have a lot of patience, and sometimes not even in a, I just, you know, that's your nature. And sometimes that is part of it. They were impatient with him. They were unkind on a daily and hourly manner. And we have to consider our words. And I think it's something so important. And we've talked a lot about that in the class, because this book is as much about the friends as it is about Job. It's as much about his friends and Job as it is about God finally answering. Matthew Henry says, I like Matthew Henry an awful lot. And he says, Job says, if I am in error, it is I who must smart for it. And therefore you need not concern yourself. Nay, it is I that do smart, and smart severely for it. And therefore you need not add to my misery by your reproaches. He says, I'm already hurting bad enough. You can feel great about yourself if you choose to because of my trouble, Job says. I can't help myself. If it makes you feel exalted, I can't do anything about that. God is the author of all of this. And so I'm stuck here. I can't get out. It's like I'm in a net. I'm captured. I'm like an animal. I have no way to escape because God is the one who has set the net before me. And so there's no need for your accusations. I'm already contending with God. And for a time, it seems God has turned his ear away. God will finally present himself, even if it is in the grave. And so it is. We don't understand sometimes the things that are happening to us in our lives. And life can be hard. And there may be no reason for it, or there may be. It could be. I mean, I do think often about the passage in Psalms 119 that without my afflictions, I would not know you the way I know you. That affliction brings us to an understanding of God himself. And it makes us yearn for him and cling to him. He has fenced up my way so that I cannot pass. He has set darkness in my path. He has stripped me of my glory and taken the crown from my head. He breaks down on every side. And I am gone. My hope he has uprooted like a tree. He has also kindled his wrath against me, and he counts me as one of his enemies. His troops come together and build up their road against me. They encamp all around my tent. He has removed my brothers far from me. My acquaintances are completely estranged from me. My relatives have failed. My close friends have forgotten me. I mean, that's who he's talking to. You know, those who dwell in my house and my maidservants count me as a stranger. I'm an alien in their sight. I call my servant, but he doesn't give me an answer. I mean, I have no authority over anybody anymore. They're not listening to me. I beg him with my mouth. My breath is offensive to my wife. I'm repulsive to the children of my own body. Even young children despise me. I arise and they speak against me. All my close friends abhor me. And those who I love have turned against me. My bones cling to my skin and my flesh. I've escaped by the teeth of my skin. Have pity on me. Have pity on me, oh, you, my friends, for the hand of God has struck me. Why do you persecute me as God does and are not satisfied with my flesh? You know, there are times in this text that Job does get some of this wrong. It is not, in a sense, in the very truest sense, it is not God who has afflicted him, and it's Satan who has afflicted him. But I will tell you that God has allowed the trap to be set before him. God has allowed him affliction so that he might show his own way. I mean, first off, when he had the conversation with Satan, he says, I have pretty much confidence in him. I have a lot of confidence in Job. And I think you're going to find that you're wrong about him. And you know, when Job comes back and he says, okay, I've taken everything from me, but if you let me touch his body, and God says, I'm telling you, I don't think he'll leave me. It is with great interest that God watched. I think we need to think about that in our own lives. When we have losses and afflictions and darkness in our life, God's watching us. And so is everybody else. And how we deal with that is important. It's part of our religious being. It's who we are. Do we really believe what we say we believe? That's what Job was struggling with. He said, I really do believe the grave is going to be where my hope is. Do we really believe that? Because if we do, it changes the way we deal with affliction. I think we're told to be joyful. We have to continue to be lights. People aren't drawn to people that are moping around all the time and sad. People aren't drawn to people that always need something. We have to be good and right, even when we are faced with affliction. He's saddened, he's confused. He knows that God has at least allowed somebody to believe that to count him as an enemy. And yet at the same time, through all of this, he never doubted that God loved him. Never once does he deny that God loved him. He believed God loved him. He talks about that. And he, in that sense, glorified God, which is an incredible thing. You ever think about the fact that we are told that we can glorify God in our actions? I think that's a remarkable thing, to think that you have the privilege to be a glory to God because of the way you deal with something in life. I think that's quite incredible. I think it's a privilege, and I think it's a wonderful thing that God has allowed us to understand. And so in his misery, he was a glory to God. And Job didn't fully understand that, certainly, but God counted him as a faithful friend. God watched him with great interest, even perhaps pointing out to Satan, who had struck him. Job has still not left me, has he, Satan? I'm watching, Satan. You still haven't done anything bad enough to him to leave me. You see, Satan, there are those who believe that well in me. It's an incredible thing to think about. You ever think about your name being discussed? I don't know. Maybe that happens. He's watching us. He's caring for us. He knows how we feel when we lose someone or something, or just get weary. You ever get so weary that you cry? That you don't know how you're going to carry everything? You ever think about, that you feel like you're pulling others along, or you feel like you're maxed out? How are you going to do more? And he's watching, and perhaps we're glorifying him. How can we be his and know his love unless he refines us, unless he chastens us, unless he demands our wills to be conformed to his, unless he makes us have enough faith in him to go against the odds of everything that is happening? How can God be a father unless we are his children, children who learn his very nature through affliction and trials? And yet it feels like war at times. These are the things that he's described his troops. He said, God, you've lined your troops up against me. It's like and he was at war. We're at war. We're at war. Look at Job's description. Troops gather, roadblocks make the way hard and impassable, and he feels isolated and surrounded. He says, I'm a soldier with no footman. There's no one in the foxhole with me. Everybody's gone. My enemy has taken them all captive. Says, even my brothers have left. Satan has got a hold of everybody. My enemy is captivated everybody against me. And those who have left, such as his friends and those of his household, God's given orders to attack him. It's rich and colorful language. Certainly we feel that way as we put our armor on. We know that we're not fighting the principalities and powers of darkness, but we're fighting in this earth. We are soldiers of Christ. At times alone, at times even those who we love are against us. At times we have great losses. At times we're in pain. We have sores, and yet God is never against us. And we must never consider the things happening to us as things that God is not watching. He says, Job says, my body has left me. There's no strength. There's no beauty left. There's nothing to admire anymore. Job was quite the man. He was quite the man. We've been around these guys. We've been around these people. He was lovely to look at. He obviously was well liked and well respected, and he had great possessions, and he had wonderful children, and he was the man. But he says, and in my state, the very least you should do is feel bad for me. That's the very least you could do, is feel bad for me. Just have some form of pity on me, is the way he ends that passage. Oh, that my words were written. Oh, that they were inscribed in a book, that they were engraved on a rock with an iron pen and lead forever. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and he shall stand at last on earth. And after my skin is destroyed, this I know, that in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another. How my heart yearns within me. If you should say, how shall we persecute him? Since the root of the matter is found in me, be afraid of the sword for yourselves. For wrath brings the punishment of the sword, that you may know there is a judgment. These are really interesting words, perhaps some of the most interesting in the book. I've often wondered when I've taught Job, I've thought a lot about this. I don't know. I know that God does not allow us to be tempted and tried more than we are capable of bearing. And I don't know if he gave Job some particular knowledge, some particular assurance or not. It is a portion where he certainly, of the text, that he certainly speaks of Jesus. That is not an unusual thing for us to think about. If you read Hebrew 11 and you look at all of those commendable people, all of those people who are commended to us for their faith, starting with Adam and Noah and Abel, who offered the more acceptable sacrifice, and you go through that line of people, even before Job would have lived, and certainly at the time of Job, when we look at Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. In Hebrews 11, then starting in verse 13, it says, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off. They were assured of them. They embraced them, and they confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind the country from which they had come out, they would have had the opportunity to return. But now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. There are texts in the New Testament that I believe show that they understood something about a heavenly country. That they understood that they were sojourners. And I don't think it was just about just the nation of Israel. It wasn't just about the land that they were going to. I mean, Abraham never saw that land. And yet he had faith that there was something he was going to. All of those listed in Hebrews, they looked to a homeland. They knew that they had not arrived to the heavenly. They understood, as Job seems to understand here, that they were sojourners on the earth. Job seems to imply that here. Look at this text. This is Job's creed. It's his confession of faith, his belief in the Father, the Almighty, the maker of the heaven and the heavens and the earth, and the principles of natural religion that he had so often professed really are summarized here. Even greater, he's no stranger to the revelation of a promised Redeemer, a promised inheritance, an understanding of a resurrection from the dead, life in a world to come. Now, none of this would have been possible for any of them without Jesus. Obviously, Jesus's blood is what allowed them then to receive the promise, which is why I think I think the Mountain of Transfiguration is one of the most interesting things to think about. That Moses and Elijah would come and say, come on, you got to do this. You know, we need you to do it. I mean, I just think about that. Abraham needs you to do it, you know? We know what you're going to suffer. I mean, that's what this was all about. Christ really was weighing out what was about to happen to him as a man in the physical. And they come in these transfigured bodies and say, we need you to do this. You can do this. It's just incredible to think about. And I think about Job. Somehow he understood something, an understanding of this resurrection. He took comfort with the expectation of something beyond. Thus, the hope is not a restoration in the world. I mean, these men had come and they had said, what? Well, he says 10 times, I say, probably 100 times by now, they've said, just turn back to God, just do what's right, and everything will be restored. And he says, that's not what restoration is. That's not what my hope is. Can you imagine? I'm 63, and if somebody came to me and said, oh, don't worry, Liz, everything's just going to be restored, and you're just going to get to live here. That would be a catastrophe to me, to think that my hope in heaven would be delayed by some hope of an earthly, what could be restored for me? I was not beautiful, but I wasn't bad. Look, restoration of what? Youth? Restoration of what? Even a grandchild coming back, even my parents coming back, even my brother coming back. That's not that's not my hope. And that's what Job is saying. He took comfort with something beyond, a hope in something beyond this, beyond the flesh, a life beyond. I think he's very clear here. He didn't have some type of false illusion about an expectation that everything would return to him. God does allow him to have happiness on earth again, but I'm telling you, unless God erased his memory, he had lost those children. There is no way. You don't replace a child with another child. It doesn't happen like that. My parents lost their firstborn child. He was a boy. And us 5 children that followed didn't ever replace him. They talked about him. And when my younger brother died at the age of 49, nothing could replace that with my parents. You don't replace. That's not what happens. Restoration, hope doesn't come in the earth. They could have had 1,000 children and it wouldn't have replaced Stephen, their firstborn. It doesn't work like that. And Job knows that. He says, I told you, he said, I'm fenced up, verse 8. His hope was removed like a tree in verse 10. However, this blessing had been revealed to him, he's aware God has allowed him to rise above the affliction and stake a hope well beyond the earth. That's where we stake our hope. If it's the Oklahoma land run, that's what we're going for, man. That's where we put our stake. Surely this is the greatest blessing for everybody, for all of us, as we consider our lives. Surely that's what we have hope in. And just as God intends, Job's words here show the spirit quieted by this hope. Job never again will speak as harshly as he has in the past. It almost seems as if his spirit is quieted by this. That hope and that still in the storm, having cast an anchor of the turmoil beyond that veil. His mind was kept steady from this time forward. And like I said, that's why I wonder sometimes if God had given him this revelation, if through his prayers and his reaching out to God, God had assured him. You can say whatever you want, he says, dear friends, but I know my Redeemer lives. I know of my hope. My conscience is clear. Sin does not reign over me. And there will be a better judge than you. And this old body is beaten and done and will be replaced. The considerations of God's coming will make a very small thing, will make a very small thing out of men's judgment. Whatever men says about us, 1 Corinthians 4, verses 3 and 4, it doesn't matter. It does not matter. Don't live your life bitter. Don't live your life mad. It doesn't matter what somebody else says about you. First off, I remember going over to a young woman's house in DC, and she was just riddled with anxiety all the time. And she was so worried about this and worried about that. And she said, well, I don't know what people think. And I said, well, first off, number one, it doesn't matter what they think. And secondly, they're not thinking about you. People are not sitting around thinking about you. That's just one more way for us to think of ourselves much more highly than we ought to. Nobody's spending their days thinking about Liz Roberts and everything I've ever done in my life. They're just not. It's not realistic. And besides, it doesn't matter as long as I know what God thinks of me. And there are things I've done that I'm ashamed of. And I pray to God to forget them, and I know to forgive me, and I know He's forgotten them, and I still pray. But that's what judgment will do for us, is those who we have wronged or said something about or done something we shouldn't. He will right that wrong. I can't wait. It's going to be great. This is the entire heart of our lives. Job wishes that his words concerning these hopes would be written for everybody. He says, you guys may not listen to me. You may never listen to me. I wish generations from now people would hear this. Well, they do. And we do. And it has been written, and it has been inscribed in a book. He says, I suffer now, but I know my Redeemer lives. I will see God, and I yearn for that day. And I don't know why these things are happening to me. And I don't know why right now it seems that God has forsaken me. I don't know why my body has taken on all these afflictions and sores, but I know that my God is in heaven and that I will be with Him, and He will right the wrongs. And He'll get me out of this trap, this net that He has set for me. And this should have ended the conversation. There should have been no more discussion at this. It was a warning to these friends. He says, I'm going to tell you something. It's not just going to be me that faces God. It's going to be you that faces God. And there's going to be a judgment for all. And I am feeling pretty secure about it. And you need to think about it. And then Job answered and said, and this is the last of the text, and this is when he's answering Zophar. Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar. And Job answered and said, listen carefully to my speech, and let this be your consolation. Bear with me that I may speak, and after I've spoken, keep mocking. As for me, and I said, this language, apparently, I'm not a scholar in this, but from what I read, this language settles down. His spirit does seem to be quieted. He is now resolved, both in his affliction and his hope. And that's where we ought to be. And he says, and after I've spoken, keep mocking. As for me, is my complaint against man? And if it were, why should I not be impatient? Look at me and be astonished. Put your hand over your mouth. Even when I remember, I am terrified, and trembling takes hold of my flesh. So he's now going to give this final, softer exchange. He says, first, you need to listen. You need to hear what I'm saying. Listen with your ears. He tells them that his appeal is not with man anyway. Men can't judge him. They can't answer for his condition. It's God who he needed, and he felt confident that one day he would see him. And when I remember the days of my tragedy, I tremble to remember and think of it. I don't know what you guys do. I don't know how you can't be terrified and trembling as well when you think about everything that's happened to me. You ever think about those days? People will talk about where were you, or what happened, where were you, and what'd you think, and how'd you feel when these things happened? 9/11 or Pearl Harbor or whatever it is. I think on a more even personal note, we think about the days we lost people, or the days we found out we had cancer, or the days we found out our children had a loss or done something, a disappointment. We found out we were in a situation we didn't anticipate being in. Those are the days that we might remember. And that's what he's saying. He said, I tremble. I think about the days that what happened to me, and it astonishes me. I don't quite know what to do with it. I tremble. I don't know how you guys can't tremble. He says, why do the wicked live and become old? Yes, become mighty in power. Their descendants are established with him in their sight. The accusation and the conversation has been, wicked people, this happens to wicked people. Wicked people are punished. Wicked people lose their lives. Wicked people, have these things happen to them. Good people don't. That's their assumption. They've already said that. They said, if you'll come back to God, everything will be restored. I mean, that is the evangelical message of our culture for sure. Come to Christ and you'll have many blessings. That is not the promise. It's never been the promise. It wasn't the promise then. And Job knew it. And so he says their descendants are established with them in their sight and their offspring before their eyes. Their houses are safe from fear. Neither is the rod of God upon them. This is what they told him. Their bulls breed without failure, their cows and calves without miscarriage. He says this all happens to wicked people. You've said this never, wicked people are all punished, and that's what's happening to you. He says that's not true. They send forth their little ones like the flock, and their children dance. They sing with the tambourine in the heart, and they rejoice to the sound of the flute, and they spend their days in wealth, and in a moment go down to the grave. Yet they say to God, depart from us. For we do not desire the knowledge of your ways. Who is the Almighty that we may serve him? And what profit do we have if we pray to him? Indeed, their prosperity is not in their hand. The counsel of the wicked is far from me. He says, you have addressed the fact. You have accused me of being wicked because everybody who's wicked gets punished like this. That's what's happening to you. Just look. And he says, just look. He simply addresses the truth that many people in this world live long lives with great prosperity, and they're openly wicked. Openly wicked, proud and arrogant in their behavior, turn their back on God, disown God, say they don't even believe in him. And he says, on the very surface of what you've said to me, you just have to look at the world and know that it is not true. It's just not true on the very surface. God doesn't judge the wicked in this life. It's not true that immediate judgment comes upon them. They aren't the victims of calamity. In fact, a lot of times, the more blessed they become by their wickedness, the more wickedness they do. The more they deceive, the more they cheat, the more they say lies, the more blessings fall upon them in this earth. He points out that sometimes it gets even better and better for them. And that one sin can lead to another sin. And it becomes worse and worse. They live in peace and comfort. They dismiss God, yet they don't see his rod. They become old and they have honor and they have respect. People revere them. People honor them. We know this in our lives, ladies. We know that this happens. They get satisfaction because others serve them. Others talk and even say things just to please them. Their authority lives on and lives long. The logic of Job's friend is not real. It's not reality. Job even describes here large families. They have security and safety. Their cattle increases. They have no disappointments in them. They're continuous and constant in their days of wealth. They never know what it means to want anything. In fact, they don't even suffer death. It takes them like that. He says it just takes them suddenly. They don't even have pain. They don't even suffer illnesses. They just, some of them can even just fall asleep without pain and without suffering and without long illnesses. That's a blessing. That's a great blessing to watch someone die without that anxiety of pain. And there's no reason for the accusation of his heart that they have had. They have judged him by the measures of life. He says, how often is the lamp of the wicked put out? How often does their destruction come upon them? The sorrows God distributes his anger. They are like straw before the wind, and and like chaff that a storm carries away. They say God lays up one iniquity for his children. Let him recompense him, that he may know it. Let his eyes see his destruction, and let him drink from the wrath of the Almighty. For what does he care about his household after him, when the number of his mouths cut in half? Can anyone teach God knowledge, since he judges those on high? One dies in his full strength, being wholly at ease and secure. His pails are full of milk, and his marrow of his bone is moist. Another dies in the bitterness of his soul, never having eating his pleasure. They lie down alike in the dust, and mourns cover them both. Death is the great equalizer. That's what this is. Death's the great equalizer. Doesn't matter how you die. He says, how often do you see those who are wicked die because of their wickedness? It's just not valid. He reconciles here holiness and the justice of God. Though the wicked prosper all of their days, their wickedness will not go unpunished. Even if they've ignored God, they're going to meet him. Even as they prosper, they are weak and they are vulnerable. They are like the shaft that the storm carries away. Even in their prosperity, man is well fitted, he says, for destruction, and all continually lie exposed to it. Every life is fragile. In a moment's time, we can be taken. Even in the heights of pomp and power, everybody is one step away from ruin. God is always watching. He's always working. He keeps an exact count of the activities of men, good and evil, and he will justly punish. And though some prosper in this world, there will be a reckoning in the grave. It will be the great equalizer. The misery of those who are lost, those who are counted as evil doers and sinners, is here set forth in a few horrible words. They will drink the wrath of the Almighty God. Job said, what you say is not right, but what you say is right. The wicked will be punished. Not on the earth. No greater words to fear. And he even talks about how it's likely that the households after him will also reap the same punishment. And who would call God to come before him and blame him of his conduct? He says, you want to take God on and his judgments of people? Are you going to go out there and blame God for the way he governs the world? Are you going to teach God how he needs to punish the wicked and when he needs to punish the wicked? That's what you sound like, you arrogant friends who have come to have compassion on me. Who can tell God what a sinner is and who he is, and to spare him, and which to punish and which not to punish? He who has all authority and ability to judge is on high. The angels in heaven he can judge, the princes, the rulers of the earth he can judge. Everybody is accountable to him. And death is the great equalizer. Whether you're great or whether you're powerful or whether you have pomp and circumstance in this life or have nothing, everybody will be judged. Job says, you're right, evil people will be punished. But not until death. And then he talks about how somebody can die full of strength, die suddenly, not weakened by age or sickness, no apprehension of death, no fear of it, still full of life and vigor, expecting life for many more years and yet cut off in a moment. And another can die slowly with a great deal of pain and misery. They can linger, they can become bitter at the experience. Job was experiencing that. No appetite for food, no pleasure in it, through sickness and age and sorrow of mind. That's the experience of others. He says death comes all different ways. And yet it doesn't matter. No man controls the experience of our own death. Rich or poor, good or evil, healthy or unhealthy, we all meet it. We lie down like the dust with the worms. And so Job's friends have assumed much here. But Job says, if one wicked man dies in a palace and another in a dungeon, it does not matter. They will meet the congregation of the dead and be damned or saved. Wickedness is not brought before evil punishment on earth, but is met in the grave. I'm going to really quickly end this last so that we are done with the text. Look, I know your thought and the schemes with which you would wrong me. For you say, where is the house of a prince, and where is the tent and the dwelling place of the wicked? Have you not asked those who travel the road? And do you not know their signs? For the wicked are reserved for the day of doom. They shall be brought out of the day of wrath, who condemns his way to his face, and who repays him for what he has done. Yet he shall be brought to the grave, and a vigil kept over the tomb. The clods of the valley shall be sweet to him. Everyone shall follow him, as countless have gone before him. How then can you comfort me with empty words, since falsehood remains in your answer? He ends here with the end of an evil man's life. He says, the wicked fall. The wicked will eventually die. And though they don't fall into visible ruin, they will be judged. He talks here, he concludes here with the same opposition to his friend's word. He opposes their opinion that the wicked should fall into visible and remarkable ruin. He talks here about how they will have great funerals. There'll be many great words said about wicked people after they die. I mean, you ever had somebody preach somebody into heaven who you knew probably didn't deserve it? That's what this is talking about. He talks about what Enoch really did in Jude 1, where Enoch preached and prophesied to people. And he said, listen, you guys keep living this way. You're going to meet judgment. You're going to meet judgment. You're going to meet judgment. Isn't that interesting for Enoch, who never did? He walked with God and was taken. He never faced death, but he tells him, he says, death's going to come to you. And you guys need to be aware of this. And that's really what he's talking about here. The sinner, he says, will have a splendid funeral. Something that a poor man may never have a prospect of. He'll have a stately monument, the valley of springs of water to keep the turf green. There's just this honorable burial place. There's wicked and evil people with monuments and graves all over this world. When you travel, you go into some of the cathedrals of the world, and there's all kinds of graves within these religious structures that bear the bones of the wicked. He talks about how such things are vain distinctions. Death closes his prosperity. It is but a poor encouragement to die, that others have died before us. So we see this in life, and Job says, you guys know this. And so what Job ends with really is that what we need to know is that prosperity does live in this earth for those who are wicked, but that we have something of hope that is better. It's an interesting thing to think about. I want to read it real quickly as I end here. I want to read something out of Charles Swindoll's book. I'm not as crazy about this book on Job. I mean, I like it okay, but I thought this was interesting because sometimes when we see somebody who has everything in life, and they seem to kind of have everything sorted, we tend to then not think that the light is valuable for them, that the hope is not really something they're going to be interested in. And I think it is an interesting thing to think about. And that's what Job was saying. He said, let me tell you something. Those who are prospering in this life need to know that they're going to face God, that there's something beyond. He says we need to get the stereotyped images of lost people out of our minds. Far too many Christians have the idea that because a person is an unbeliever, he's stupid. It's not true. Many are lost, and many of the lost are brilliant. In fact, some of them more brilliant than many of us who would ever dream of being. Furthermore, many of the lost live easier lives than many of us. And they aren't instantly judged or taken from this earth before turning 40. Many of them live well and live long, even though they live alienated from the Almighty. It's easy to let that reality confuse us. He says, not long ago, I read of a pastor and a deacon who had plans to do some visiting of the lost in their neighborhood. One particularly notorious unbeliever who was well known in the community had visited the church that previous Sunday. We all have visitors come in among us, and we need never to assume that one would accept and one would not the gospel message. They're all in need. Everybody's in need. We're all in need. So he had signed the visitor's card, including his address, so they decided to drop by and talk with him about the good news. They rode together in the same car, and when they arrived in this exclusive residential section, they wound their way around this long driveway which circled in front of his large and gorgeous house. The lawn was thick and manicured. The landscaping was elegant. Kids were playing hopscotch out in the driveway. They could see past the inner motor courtyard into the backyard, where there was a beautiful pool with a large splashing fountain. There were 3 luxurious cars sitting beyond the brick arches, all of them new and spotless. Tucked away in the 4th garage was a classic bright red Ferrari. Parking their car out front, both men could see the man of the house through the window of his study. He was sitting in a large soft leather chair, laughing with his friends and having the greatest time. munching on a handful of popcorn with a tall, icy beverage in the other hand. At that moment, the young deacon turned to his pastor and said, "Now tell me again, what kind of good news do we have for this guy?" And I think that's an interesting way to think about it. You know, the assumption that Job's friends had is that everybody who prospered was fine, that there was no need of a hope, and that everybody who was afflicted needed to set their minds on a hope. God will judge, death will equalize, and everybody needs the hope of heaven, something beyond this life. And if life treats you well, that's wonderful. Those are great blessings. But if you have losses, it allows you to see a hope that's beyond this life. Again, Psalms 119, I'm grateful for my afflictions, for they have allowed me to know you. It is certainly the message of Job's text. All right, let me turn off here. I know I went a little bit over, but I didn't want to stop because we're not going to have the class until June. We'll start on the next round